I'd like to welcome you all to the Aspen Ideas Festival. I'm Meghan O'Sullivan. I'm a professor at Harvard University, where I focus primarily on energy and international affairs and security. And today, you have joined us for a panel called Inventing the Future. And I'd like to thank you for joining us. And I'd like to say that I look at this audience as a group of self-selected risk takers. Because after all, it is a little hard to know exactly what you're getting yourself into when you come to a panel called Inventing the Future. And I think often when people think about inventing the future, you might expect that we will be up here talking about crazy inventions like time travel. But instead, we're going to take a different approach today. We are actually going to marry two distinctly unsexy things, concrete and batteries. And we're going to marry those two things with the very trendy worlds of venture capital, of carbon emissions, of energy efficiency, and such matters. We're also going to talk about the role of startups in revolutionizing 2,000-year-old industries. And in order to do that, I have two wonderful entrepreneurs with me, Jay Whitacre and Tom Schuler. To my left is Jay Whitacre, and Jay is the founder and now chief technology officer of a company called Acqueon Energy. And this is a company that focused primarily on changing the way the world uses energy by focusing on energy storage. Jay is also an associate professor at Carnegie Mellon, and he's worked for Caltech and for Jet Propulsion Labs. And then a little bit further on is Tom Schuler, and Tom is the president and CEO of Solidia Technologies, which is a company that's focused on the construction sector. And Tom has led two companies that have had global operations with revenues greater than $1 billion, including DuPont's Building Innovations. So it is my pleasure to introduce them to you, and I'd like to begin by giving them each an opportunity to talk about the innovations they work on and how they fit into these themes of revolutionizing old industries. And with that, I'd like to start with Jay.
Thank you. So what is innovation, first of all? And there's a variety of academic definitions for that. But what I really want to talk about is my experience of taking a very 100-year-old technology, a battery. You think of lead-acid batteries in your car, or the batteries you put in your cell phone now that are rechargeable, and you put energy in and get it out. And we rely on these every day. Very common. And typically, if you told me 20 years ago this would be my life, that I would be trying to reinvent the way energy is stored using sort of a different play on a very common technology, I would have been maybe underwhelmed. But I also at the time wouldn't have understood all the problems in the world. But to get from taking this old technology and infusing it with new ideas, the first innovation is actually the process of innovation itself. I started about 5 or 6 years ago trying to understand and actually evaluating not batteries and not materials, but how materials are innovated. What it is that allows you to take something quickly from an idea to the marketplace or to something that's going to have an impact on someone's life. And my assessment was, and after reading a lot and doing a fair amount of digging, is that it takes between 8 to 12 years to take a technology that's materials intensive from an idea to a profit-bearing or even a revenue-bearing thing in the marketplace. That's a very long time. And if you cross that duration with the kinds of limitations that we have right now with the energy problem and the fact that we need an awful lot of energy storage these days to support the amount of renewable energy that people want to insert on the grid or in distributed environments, you realize that we don't have that much time. And if you don't have that much time, you have to reevaluate the way you think about innovation. And so in 2007 and 2008, I wanted to do stationary energy storage at a very large scale. The realization at that point was that if we didn't do this, if we didn't have enough energy storage, we wouldn't be able to put the amount of renewables on the grid that we wanted to, or indeed bring the next billion people around the world into a better living condition by giving them less clean energy or any energy at all. So with that, I sort of, instead of starting with a discovery and then seeing how can I make this discovery work, I started instead with what it had to look like. It had to be very low cost, had to come from ubiquitous materials that were easy to process, And it had to be something that was completely non-toxic. It's something you could eat. I mean, it had to be really, really basic. And I made a list of the materials that might answer that question, and a list of the processing techniques that might be, potentially useful to process those materials. And I came with an extremely short list of potential experiments that I should really hammer away at. The idea eventually evolved to a saltwater battery. Use sodium in water, neutral pH, so it was neither acidic nor basic, and it would not be caustic or painful or bad for the environment. And it would use very common electrode materials like a manganese or a carbon or a titania or a zinc. And I played around with these different things, and I finally got, after some very haphazard experimentation, which was intentionally chaotic. This is one of the key aspects, is if you are too focused or too linear in your research, you will go too slow. And you have to learn to fail quickly and move on to something else immediately. And so I got a couple of interesting hits, and then I engaged some venture cap people, and they were interested enough and eager enough to follow this idea that they actually funded work in my university at Carnegie Mellon for about a year. It was a true incubation project, but it was with graduate students and postdoctoral scholars, and we hammered away at this until we got to something that was sort of worthy of spinning out as a real company. As soon as we did that, this is in early 2010, late 2009. We really took presence in 2010. This is 3 years ago. We started with nothing. We had a little thing that was like this big that was able to function like a battery. It had sort of the core materials that we knew might work. And the project was make this huge. And in doing that, we made a tremendous amount of very quick decisions that were by design quick. The motto for the first year and a half was paint without tape. So you imagine painting a room or a house or something, you always put up tape along the borders to do it very cleanly. And I did a fair amount of painting as a kid, and I got to the point where I was willing to never use tape and go back and patch up my mistakes, as opposed to always take the time to put the tape up. And if you get good enough, if your hand is steady enough and you have enough learning, you can rarely need to go back and do the touch-up. So you win in the end. You save all that time and money you would have invested in the tape. So we painted without tape for about a year and a half, and it was an amazing time. We made a lot of hop, skip, jumps. We would have meetings where we would drastically change our product design in a handful of minutes based on a handful of preliminary data that we thought was at least good enough. We made decisions with not full data, but we had enough data to make what we thought were the right decisions. This happened many times. I believe it saved us 2 or 3 years. But of course, then we had something that actually worked, and we made a lot of them, and they worked. And we made a large 1,000-volt system and tied it to the grid, and it worked. And then we brought in some real people from industry who were brought in to really take it and build a factory around it. And they asked for all of our documentation, all of our quality literature, all of our description of what we had done. Please show me your validation experiments and all of your test regimens. We had nothing, absolutely nothing. And that was shocking to them because they'd seen all the progress. They saw an incredibly functional team of about 30 people who had gone from an idea to a multi-kilowatt-hour, 1,000-volt grid-tied battery with virtually no background or documentation or industrial sort of style process. And therein began a very long year. A lot of sort of retrospective trying to understand who did what when. A lot of the most important innovations that had occurred happened in a couple people's heads, and we were trying to trace why did you do this and when and who knows this. And we actually developed a real oral history and a sense of oral knowledge within the company that nothing was written down. The only people who were really satisfied with this were the intellectual property and trade secret people because we had no documentation for anybody to steal. So that was the one win we had, and I was like, oh, I did that on purpose. No. So based on all of that stuff, though, the innovation process went extremely quickly, and then it had to slow down because now we're just finishing up our factory. And so the past year has been a retranche and a real examination of how to lock down these processes. And the reality is that no matter how fast you go early on with innovation with materials and failing fast and jumping to the next thing and making it all work, you have to quit the lockdown design, and then you have to bring in a lot of people who've built factories. And that's what we have going on right now. And even though it's funny to watch sort of the culture that we had projected into this manufacturing environment. And that's something else I could talk about too, is that startups and innovation for things that require manufacturing are so different than the startup that you hear about typically in the news that's information technology. That's 3 cases of Red Bull and some really good programmers and 6 months. And they produce a website that they sell to Yahoo for a lot of money, and they've gone to the next one. And their product is code. It's easy to copy. They don't really ever produce physical objects. And the kind of innovation is really amazing that they do, but it's so inherently different from a situation where you make one of something and it works great. That's sort of our code. And if I was a programmer, I could put it on the web and it would be done. But that's just the beginning for manufacturing. Now you have to make 1 million of them or 1 billion of them. And it becomes really imposing. And it changes the investment strategy. It changes the amount of CapEx that you need. If you are doing something truly novel, you probably can't farm out much of your idea. You're going to have to build a factory to build it. And that factory is going to cost a lot of money. And you're going to be a pre-revenue company for a while. And so I'm now sitting on a pre-revenue company that will have spent over $80 to $90 million by the end of this year without ever having really sold a single product level device. We've got a lot of things out there, but not the products is just now starting. And that is an awfully high cliff for most investors to look over at any time. But it's particularly imposing right now for those who have seen a lot of energy technology companies really get destroyed, eaten up either by competition overseas or by some technical flaw or by some bad management. And so the investment world is also very complex in this regard. And I'm proud to say that we're negotiating it, and it's been a really interesting journey to watch the metamorphosis of the venture community from extremely bullish on energy technology to extremely standoffish right now. And that's something else I can talk about. So how am I doing on time?
Good. You've got another minute if you want to wrap
Another
up.
minute? 1 minute. I think that's it. I'll just wrap up and we can move on to
Great. Thanks
Tom.
so much.
Yeah.
Tom, do you want to share your experiences with us?
Be glad to, although I'm still kind of reeling from the fact that you said that concrete from New Jersey wasn't sexy.
Sorry, it wasn't a personal thing.
I tell you. So if you're going to invent the future, one of the things that I've found is that you better get really good at figuring out how to help the past transition into that future, especially when you're dealing with a 2,000-year-old market like concrete that really doesn't want to change so much. So what I thought I'd do is try to frame this so that it resonates a little bit is, you guys all filled out the registration form, right, when you signed in online? And there was a question in there that basically asked you to answer the following. What is our moral, do we have a moral obligation to society, something like that, right? Everybody answered that. Not, maybe a few things. So I talked to some of the organizers, and what they said was, a lot of people didn't answer it because it's really hard. And it is. So how do I take an industry that knows that they need to change? They know they need to be more sustainable. They know that it's part of their future, it's part of their survival. And how do I convince them that this moral obligation that they have is something that needs to become part of their business plan? In effect, what we've got to figure out how to do is, how do we take that moral obligation and actually make it a moral motivation so that it actually compels them to act? Right? A lot of people feel they have obligations. It's kind of heavy. It's a burden. But how do you actually get somebody to move and go do something? So that kind of mirrors my sustainability journey, if you will. I started off the same way most people did. Sustainability makes a lot of sense. We should be taking care of the planet. And then I ran a couple of businesses where I quickly learned that if we were going to be competitive longer term, these are global businesses, very large, I had to figure out a way to become more sustainable, or we weren't going to be able to make it. That had to be an element of our competitiveness going forward. So this is where startups come in. So I've had the fortune of being able to do this with large companies and now with startups, and the answer comes out the same. But startups provide a really interesting value to this process. They really are a catalyst. They're a little bit of a poke in the ribs, if you will, to the industry to really get them moving down that road to motivation as opposed to obligation. We also do something that companies, especially big companies, kind of struggle with, and that's dealing with risk. One of the things that you hear, and the day that I started, the word that I picked up faster than anything was de-risk. Large companies have trouble with new technologies because they don't know how to manage the risk. That's what startups are designed for. We're designed to take that risk out, and we provide that service to those large companies. And the last thing is that, we got to do it quickly. I mean, we're set up to be impatient, right? And especially with sustainability, if we don't find a way to get a little bit more impatient, we're going to have companies that aren't competitive going forward. So that's a service that we provide. So let's talk a little bit about the market and where we started. Jay started with a great idea. We started in the marketplace. The concrete market has been around for a long time, thousands of years. You guys probably know the Romans were probably the last ones that you know about that used it expansively. And then, I don't even know how to tell you this, but somebody lost the recipe. Let me say that again. They lost the recipe for concrete in the Dark Ages. I mean, can you imagine being that guy when he went to work the next day? Sorry. So when they rediscovered it in the 1700s, it was a new thing. It wasn't Roman concrete, but it was pretty close. And it fundamentally hasn't changed since then. There have been a couple of innovations, but this is an industry that really has not changed much in a long time. And they really are pretty comfortable with the way that they do things now. Now let's talk about scale. The scale is really mind-bending because most of us take concrete pretty much for granted. It's sad to say. Meghan.
It is.
Concrete's the second most utilized material on the face of the earth, right after water. So if I take all the plastic and all the steel and all the glass and everything else that people use and I piled it up, it would not come close to the amount that we use concrete for every day. That's how big it is. When you walk out, look around, and notice. It's really everywhere. So the challenge for a business like ours as a startup is, okay, I've got this industry that has a long-standing tradition. It's been around for a long time, and it's been doing things the same way for a long time. How do I get involved? How do I get in there and make a difference? First thing was pretty simple. You need to learn how the market works. So one of the first things that we did at Solidia when I came in was we basically kicked everybody out of the building for about 2 months. Now, you take a bunch of people with very high technical backgrounds and you say, listen, I want you to go to a paver manufacturer and I just want you to listen. I don't want you to teach anything, I just want you to learn. I want you to watch how the raw materials come in. I want you to time how long it takes them to move materials from one place to another. I want you to do precasters. I want you to go to a cement company, and I just want you to listen and learn. Because if we can't understand what their pains are, and we can't understand how we can improve what they're doing right now, we're going to have a hard time speaking the same language. Second piece that we learned very easily, you can't do it by yourself. If you're going to have an impact on an industry like this, you have got to find people to collaborate with you so that you don't relearn all the stuff they have spent thousands of years learning. A lot of people waste a lot of time trying to reinvent things that people already did a long time ago. Last part is speed. As I said earlier, one of the things that startups do is we are built for speed. And let me tell you why. There's an inherent impatience. But the key thing you need to know about startups rarely fail because they don't have a lot of smart people with a lot of great ideas. They usually just run out of time. And so I can't tell you how many times I've sat with a very large company who didn't necessarily move quickly and used that impatience, that sense of urgency, as really a ways of motivating them to do the right thing the next time and do it more quickly. And it's amazing the response that we get. They have opened their doors to us. They have taught us things that have dramatically reduced our invention curve so that we can have our technical guys really focusing on the important stuff that matters to the technology. All right, now let me tell you a little bit more about concrete, more than you ever wanted to know. So, when you see a cement truck going down the road, what's it got in it? It doesn't have cement in it. It's got concrete in it. They called it the wrong thing. They've been messing with you all this time. All right, so cement is the glue that holds concrete together. Just that simple. So if I take Portland cement, it's actually called ordinary Portland cement. There's a branding thing going on there. And I mix that with rocks and sand and water. The water reacts with the Portland cement. That glues everything together. And then you have to wait for 28 days. so that the reaction can occur. And then at 28 days, you've got your strength and you can sell it or do whatever you want to do with it. That's why you see the road signs go up and then everybody stands around for a couple of weeks. Same idea. Okay? So that's how the process works. Now, our process is a little bit different. Here's the challenge that we've got. When you make cement, you use a ton of energy. We wouldn't have enough batteries to run one of these plants. So let me tell you how much energy you need. A cement kiln is about as tall as this ceiling, and it goes for about 100 yards. And it's heated up to about 1,500 degrees Celsius. So let me give you an idea how much that is. If I take a tire, which is what they use as alternate fuels every once in a while, and I toss it into a kiln, it immediately vaporizes. It's a lot of fun to watch. Even the steel, it all just goes poof. So every ton of cement that comes out of the other end has enough energy in it to run a 60-watt light bulb for about 2 years. And these things make a lot of cement. Average plant makes about 1 million tons of cement a year. That means they can put your house out in about 6 minutes. This building would take probably about 30 minutes. So the scale is just enormous. Now here's where the difference comes in. When we use Solidia cement, we use the same raw materials, right? We take limestone and we take clay. We use a little bit different ratio. We'll put it in the same kiln that they already use, but at a much lower temperature, about 30% lower. And as a result of that, we'll use about 30% less energy than they use today. Now, you have to realize that for a cement kiln, 30% of their manufacturing cost is energy. So a 30% reduction in that number has a dramatic impact on the cost of their product and their capability to be able to compete in the market globally. Now, with that, when you heat up limestone that much and you use that much energy to heat something, you're going to put out a lot of CO2. So the industry right now is the #2 emitter of CO2 in the world. Everybody talks about power generation. The cement industry is #2 in the world. They generate about 5 to 7% of all the CO2 that goes out right now in the world. And the thing is, it's not something that they're not trying to address. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development has got a cement sustainability initiative that has all of the top cement companies trying to figure out how to get this thing taken care of. They're working really hard to figure it out, but their chemistry kind of locks them into something. So as you can imagine, with our chemistry, we don't have the temperature and we don't have as much limestone, so we'll put out about 30% less CO2. You know, there's a value in CO2 that we can talk about later on, but that is a very interesting conversation opener when you're talking with a cement kiln. So as you can imagine, from a cement manufacturer's perspective, this is a pretty good deal, right? So I can use the same raw materials, I can use my same equipment, I can meet all of my cost goals, and I can dramatically reduce my footprint. You know, why wouldn't I adopt this? Well, the challenge is, who's he going to sell it to? So when I have a conversation with a cement company, what they want to know is, tell me about what you do with concrete, because that's really where our technology's core is. So go back to how you make concrete, right? Water with sand and rocks and Portland cement, and you end up with concrete. So we'll take our cement, we'll use the same rocks, the same sand, and we use water, but we use water as a processing aid, right? Just to get it into the mold. But then instead of water, we react it with CO2, with carbon dioxide. When we take the carbon dioxide away, it's done. I don't have to wait 28 days. I can ship it right away. You can imagine from a concrete guy's point of view, I can dramatically change the way that they keep inventory. Most people, when they're evaluating technology, they look at the income statement. In our case, you've got to look at the balance sheet. You've got to understand cash. And if you guys have been paying attention to the construction market the last couple of years, cash matters a lot to these guys. So that being said, you know, from a concrete guy's perspective, it's a pretty good deal too. We can give them a product, but they don't have a CO2 problem. So really, the only motivation that they've got is that my product better be better than what they're doing today. So I can't talk to them about green cement because green cement's not something they can sell today. So I have to be able to show them how the product that they've got is going to be better than what they're currently doing. And fortunately, ours is. And that's where we spend all of our research, and all of our IP is in that area, looking at each application and making sure that we understand inside and out, from the raw materials all the way down to the guy installing it in the application. So we put pavers in our driveway. We ripped up the parking lot a little bit, put our pavers in, And I had our guys out there talking to the installers, understanding how it cut, how easy it was to install. It's a stupid paver, but you know what? It's in that understanding that you find out where the real value of the technology is. So we've gotten to the point where if the cement industry adopted our technology across the board, which they're not going to do, but they've got goals for 2050 that would be satisfied by 2015. So this is something that's not just rounding error for these guys. They're not doing it because they want to put something in their annual report. They're doing it because it has a tremendous impact on their business. We had a Japanese customer come in a couple of weeks ago, and he said, "You don't understand." He said, "I've been trying to do this, to use CO2 to cure my product for 20 years, and I never could do it. So I had to come, I had to see it." So we took him out in the lab, and in 15 minutes, we did what he'd been working on for 20 years. So this has an impact on these guys. So back to where startups come in. All right, so startups are there because we got a lot of smart people with a lot of good ideas. And we've got this impatience that we think is really going to bring something to this industry and really help the industry go forward. I think the challenge for us going forward is we need people to help us break barriers. Right? We don't want to have to relearn stuff. So we need partners and collaborators, whether it's government or other companies or universities, they're going to help us cut through some of the stuff that everybody already knows how to do so that we can really focus on the other stuff. You know, there's no silver bullet for sustainable technologies like Jay's in mind. You know, there's not one thing that's just going to solve everybody's ills. You have to go after this market by market, application by application, and that's the only way that you're going to be successful. Right? For us, we want to make sure that our cement and our concrete customers have to have our technology. They can't afford not to, and so they're going to have to adopt it. So for us, if you're trying to invent the future, you know, for us the key thing is to make sure that as we go forward, you know, we're teaching people how to turn problems into solutions. We're trying to show them how sustainability can be profitable, and we're pushing them all along the way. And that's pretty sexy.
I promise you, Tom, I will never look at concrete the same way again.
There you go.
Or I think will anyone in this audience. Let me ask you a few questions before we open up to audience questions. I'll start with you, Jay. We hear a lot about renewable energy, and we know that one of the biggest inhibitors to adopting renewables at a grand scale is the intermittency problem, the fact that the sun doesn't shine at night, the wind doesn't blow necessarily when we want it to. If your technology proves out at scale, how much will that affect things like transportation, and how much will it affect our energy mix? Does it mean that gas actually has less of a role in our economy that people are thinking it will right now, because gas is currently the big enabler to renewables?
Right. So this is first very location specific. It depends on where you are. What is the wind resource? What is the solar resource? And it also depends greatly on what your cost issues are, what your economics locally are, and what the current set of energy provision is. In North America, our grid is old, dated, but our power is very cheap. Energy is very cheap. So the idea really is, from our perspective, is we see a tremendous amount of opportunity in places where right now diesel is the prime source of energy. And you might think, well, that must not be very many places because diesel is used for big trucks, not for baseload power. But if you go to Puerto Rico, or you go to Chile, or you go to some Hawaiian islands, or you go to Malaysia, or the Philippines, or India, you'll find locations that are not grid tied, either because they're physically an island, or they are on a grid island where they don't really have good interconnects. And they also have very poor transportation of most fuels, and they are forced to buy diesel, which these days is not that inexpensive compared to, say, the newest low-cost solar panels from China, which are very cheap now. So in the past 3 or 4 years, the solar panels have become so cheap that they've purchased them, and they've got enough of them, they think, well, heck, if I got enough of these, I could, and have got some batteries, I'll just use only solar. So during the day, they would charge the solar panels, and at night, they would use lead-acid batteries. And turns out lead-acid batteries, if you deep discharge them every night and let them stand for a little while before you can recharge them when the sun comes up in the morning, they fail very quickly, a year or two, and then they're almost done. And so about a year or so after the price bottom out of the PV panels, we started to get cold calls from people who had found us on the web, and they said, is your technology real? Because if it is, it will change the way we look at doing this, because right now we can find no technology that is inexpensive enough to allow us to do what we call baseload solar. And we say, of course we're real. Give us some time. And which we have none, because we're a startup and we're impatient and we have no time. But so the case here that I'm talking about, there's a handful of major solar integrators now that we have memorandums of understanding or indeed orders with, who are doing just this. They are installing large solar arrays in places like Puerto Rico or Chile or Hawaii, and they are doing it with our batteries, and they are going to be turning off the diesel generators entirely. And instead of having to burn a bunch of dirty stuff, they are going to use the sun entirely. And so it starts small. We have a couple years of demonstrations, and then the next orders are enormous. One of the questions is, can you provide 4 gigawatt hours for us in 2017? If you can, will you please build a plant in this country for us, because we'll buy everything that plant makes for 6 years. And that's how fast it gets big if the technology is proven out. So the example is quite real. And wind is the same. Wind's a bit more challenging because the intermittency is on the order of minutes and hours typically, but then there's the worst case scenario where there is a doldrum and you don't have wind for 10 days. A 10-day battery is prohibitively large. So if you just have wind as the resource and you want to have no other backup power, a battery is not the right answer. But with solar, in most locations where there's good sun and there's this need, you have a pretty good shot at it. So this is an example.
Great, thank you. Tom, I'd like to hone in on the carbon emissions part of your business model. I'm imagining you in New Jersey talking to people, and I'm wondering, how much this actually matters to them when you're trying to sell your technology. Or is the fact that it ends up reducing carbon emissions, is that more appealing to your investors than it is to your potential buyers? Or is it just something that's important to you as the leaders of your company?
Well, I mean, I think it's becoming an economic issue, and I think, as Jay said a little bit earlier, it depends on where you are. I don't spend a whole lot of time in New Jersey talking about it. I spend a lot more time in places where carbon has become part of the economy. Even whether it's a small part or not, what carbon will do, when you talk about carbon dioxide with somebody, it gets you in the door to have the conversation. But every meeting that I've ever had with a large cement company, a small cement company, anyone, the first question I ask is, okay, I've read what's on your website, I've read your annual report. How important is sustainability? And are you making decisions today on investments based on things that have to do with carbon? And depending on where you are, there's some pretty good evidence that, yeah, they care a lot. 6 of the top 10 buyers of carbon credits in Europe are cement companies. Right? They know what's coming, and they're working diligently to try to get there, but they're also trying to make sure that they can be an ongoing concern when you get there. There are also places like Australia where there's a list of 500 companies. And if you're on that list of 500 emitters, you have to pay a tax. Now, for the big guys, they get a credit. Right? They get a credit on their taxes, and so it's okay. Right? It's like in Europe, it's no harm, no foul for a couple more years. But there are people at the bottom of that list who don't get the credits. And for them right now, the carbon economy is very, very real, and they are very active in pursuing technologies like ours to make sure that they can mitigate that. So carbon at the end of the day, in this time and in this place, is not something somebody's doing to feel good about themselves. It's really part of that moral motivation that we talked about earlier. They're highly motivated to do the right thing.
Great. Well, this kind of leads us into the question of policy, which I'll ask both of you about. Sure. We saw President Obama make a very important speech the other day, laying out some goals and some programs having to do with reducing carbon emissions. But still, I think it's fair to say that our country doesn't really have a comprehensive energy policy. And I'm wondering how much that affects both of your businesses or startups in the energy world in general. How does that affect, your uncertainty, how you make calculations, how you make decisions? Tom, I'll start with you.
Sure. When we first started slogging around Washington a little bit, trying to understand what the environment was for funding, one of the things that we began to understand very quickly was one of the reasons that you don't have government mandates for policy is because the technologies that are required to implement that policy are so expensive that they would effectively put the industry out of business. There was a cement company that tried to put in a carbon sequestration process, and it ended up costing more than the cement plant, and so they had to shut it down. So I think when governments begin having conversations with companies like Jay's in combination with people that are really being affected by that, whether it's a coal-fired plant or anybody else, that's when you really get very interesting policy and very interesting support that's really meaningful to the industry and certainly meaningful to companies like ours. There are places where that happens. It doesn't happen enough. Some of that, I think, is because startups have not had the influence on sustainable technologies and encouraging these collaborations with big companies to move quickly enough. We're finding that the combination of us with some larger companies that have, are of like mind, it's amazing how fast the support comes and how fast the research goes.
Mm-hmm. Jay, how important is the policy environment to what you're doing?
It's a fair question. If you examine the history of sustainable energy technology policy in the United States in the past 10, 20 years, you'll see that if you look at it, you realize that it's an incredible hot potato right now. And it's to the extent that we do not allow ourselves to rely on policy. We cannot. We have to rely on a good fundamental economic proposition. If the bottom line if we can't walk into any customer out there and say we are disruptive for economic reasons, and I don't care if you really are interested in mitigating carbon or not, you will buy our product because it's the best product for the right price, then we feel that we are in a precarious, risky position because of the political waters change so rapidly. That being said, one of the key attributes right now that is missing policy-wise in North America is a regulated way to evaluate stored energy on the grid. It doesn't exist. We have all these different degrees of regulation, deregulation in different zones around the country, and the types of energy storage and the ways that it could be valued are vastly different depending on location. And they change, right? As the grid changes, as different power plants are erected or removed or whatever. If there's a carbon tax imposed, it would shift everything again. And the fear of change makes installations of storage in North America almost impossible. The utility corporation, the utility industry in general is incredibly slow moving, and this added unknown sense of risk is absolutely killer. So without a good sense of how to evaluate energy that's stored, we really also are having a lot of trouble. So we can't think like that because it will undermine us.
So does that mean that your markets are more overseas than in the U.S.
Our entry markets are by definition overseas right now, in part for this reason. Yeah, and again, if we become cheap enough, it won't matter, right? And that's, as you look at the way we plan to develop and cost down our product and so forth, that's 2016, 2017. At that point, we may have something that's so disruptively inexpensive that even in the vast, disparate markets that exist right now, we would still be able to sell into that with much less risk. So, but right now, the capex associated with our current price points in 2014, 2015 are not enough to overcome this risk that people sense.
Okay, interesting. I'll ask you both one more question and then get some from the audience. Mm-hmm. I want to ask, kind of building on something that you said, Jay, about the venture capital environment. And certainly we've all read about Solyndra and other failures, for lack of a better word, in the energy.
It's a long list.
Yes, exactly, in the energy domain. And how has that really changed the environment in which both of you work, or the venture capital environment for energy technologies? Has there been any repercussions? Jay, I'll start with you.
It's been devastating for me. Yeah, I mean, A123 Systems was a very high-profile battery company in North America. They got hundreds of millions of dollars of government resource that was recently sold to pennies on the dollar to a Chinese interest, including IP. And that is seen as a massive loss of intellectual property and capital to our competitor overseas. And furthermore, they overpromised and underdelivered routinely. They perpetrated a fair amount of deception in the way they presented their technology to some extent, at least from a cost perspective. They had very good performance, but the costing was very challenging. And they were tied up with another massive failure, Fisker motor cars. And so this combination alone is painful. And so when you walk in the door to somebody who just lost 30, 40, 50, 70, $100 million to a battery company, you say, hey, I'm a battery company. I need some money. I'm pre-revenue. But don't believe all those other people, but you can believe me. right? It doesn't fly. And so this is so different than when A123 stock was going up and they went public and things looked good. There was a huge interest in us, and we were sort of on their coattails as they were going up. And I remember thinking, oh my God, if and when they crash, we're going to go right down behind them. And so the environment has changed. It's been very difficult. The exception is Tesla Motor Cars, who are doing well. They're a battery-based company. They have been very smart in the way they use batteries, and I applaud them. Elon Musk is very, very savvy in the way that he's used existing batteries right off the shelf from Panasonic and stuck them in a box, and he's using them in a really good way. And good for him. I mean, it's still a luxury product. It's not going to be mass appeal for a long time, but it's not losing money.
Great.
Yeah, I guess I'd go back to something Jay said earlier, and one of the key things when we go in to talk to a potential investor, and we're looking at strategics right now where we fit very nicely with what they're doing, but we can't talk about the greenness of the product. At the end of the day, we have to be viable whether there are carbon credits or not. And so what we talk about is industry transformation, what it does for the industry and the profitability that engages to them and to us, and how it aligns with some of the strategic goals that folks have. So, but also like Jay, we go overseas. I think that's where there's a sensitivity and an understanding of why things work and why they don't work that we've been able to leverage. And we've just crawled into the market, so far it's been receptive, but there's one very common thing. We don't have a Cylindra, but there's a list of green cements that have struggled over the past couple of years. Commercial, you have to have some commercial traction. And that's really the thing we're focusing on right now, that over the actually this week and next week in particular, some of that commercial traction comes into play. It's going to make it a lot easier for us to be able to go out and look for investors.
Great.
Just one more added point, just speaking of overseas, this little story about Germany. We all know Germany's got a lot of solar, right? And they just passed a law that now directly incentivizes storage in your house with the solar panels they already incentivized to put on your roof. And we recently sent some folks to a solar conference in Germany. And last year there were tens of people and tens of companies and hundreds of people at sort of the storage aspect of the solar, and it was thousands this year and many hundreds of storage companies. It's that policy in Germany alone has made a huge change in the way people look at storage, both in Germany and elsewhere. And so again, this points to potential policy issues that could really matter here domestically at some point as well.
Sure. Great. Thank you. I'd like to open it up to you all. Start in the yellow.
There's multiple yellows.
We got
yes,
all,
the woman
we got all
in yellow.
kinds of yellow.
I have a question for you, Mr. Whitacre, and it's about graphene supercapacitors. I'd like to hear your thoughts and feelings and opinions on that and the future of energy. Thank you.
So graphene is an interesting material, and it's, however, whenever we went through buckyballs, we went through nanotubes, and now we're at graphene. It's compelling. There's a lot of high-profile publications in the academic literature that spill out into the public sort of general interest media, and don't believe it, right? It's not bad. There's great results. It's very compelling. But every single result I see for a graphene-based supercapacitor, I can point you to a non-graphene-based supercapacitor that has equal performance. A lot of it is other engineering things you can do for lower cost using known techniques. And the advantages of the graphene in most cases is if you really look at the practical implementation of it at a systems level, I'm not compelled by it. I think graphene has a lot of other really interesting applications, but in energy storage, I find it to be, it's interesting. I hope there's no one who does graphene research in the audience. If there is, let's go. But I just haven't seen it, and I have done some work with graphene as well as some different nanotube work and so forth. It's really fascinating stuff, but I find it to be scientifically of interest and maybe not practical.
Great. Okay, since I'm going by color, yellow participant number 2. Let's get a microphone up here.
Is it yellow?
No.
Don Spiro, Bethesda, Maryland. When we talk about green technologies, we really want to look at the total life cycle, including the hardware. And it's my understanding, although I don't know any details, that, for example, in the manufacturing of PV panels, there's a huge energy consumption there's a lot of pollution, and then at end of life, how are they disposed of? So my question is, for Jay, maybe for Tom too, if it applies, what are the impacts of the manufacturing of both the panels and your product at the front end and the back end, and how green or not green is the overall process?
Yeah, we're just going through our first sort of carbon footprint audit right now. The results are not out yet, but because we are so scaled and our process temperatures are relatively low, I mean, it really comes down to some simple things. We have big rotary calciners as well that we send our materials through. It's not as high temperature as you guys, but it's actually very similar. If you came to our plant, you'd be surprised how similar.
We love the CO2 that comes out of it. So
yeah, exactly. And we're using natural gas as a CO2. We use indirect fire natural gas process furnaces, which while they emit CO2, they're actually fairly efficient in the way that they do that. The answer is that it's better than other storage technologies so far, coming out the back of the envelope about twice as good. But there is still a substantial impact, and it's kind of interesting to think about this. If this thing is going to store this much energy throughout its lifetime, the amount of energy you use to make it is not a small fraction of that overall energy. And it's, however, what you need to figure out also is how much carbon emissions are you offsetting by the renewables that you're enabling as well, right? So this is like, so there's the carbon footprint of the manufacturer of the thing, and then there's the overall loss in carbon emissions that are enabled by this technology when you actually implement it. So that holistic calculation is complex, and we're actually doing it because I think it's important to have those numbers. I don't have an answer for you right now, but I will tell you your question is really good.
Do you include the PV panel end of that too when you?
Oh yeah, at the system level, at the very end, it all goes together. I mean, what really matters to us, or to anybody, are two things. In this perspective, is the levelized cost of delivered energy in pennies per kilowatt hour that the person gets from that system, amortized capex and all that, and the lifetime all-in CO2 emissions from the erection of that system, right? And does the cost and the utilization help? And number three is how much CO2 have you offset by not doing it? So you turn the diesel generator off, how much would it have emitted had you not done this? So those are the three things you have to look at.
Tom, do you want to comment on that?
sure.
You guys got a lot to say to talk about.
Oh, we've got all kinds of stuff going on. People want to know, well, where's the CO2 come from? You know, it comes from the CO2 truck. Well, so the CO2 truck comes from flue gas, right? And usually the industrial gas providers will go to an ammonia plant, which has almost 98% purity, and they'll densify, clean up a little bit, and they'll sell it. When we co-locate with a cement plant or a brewery, which actually has great CO2, we can actually use that to cure our material. So the cement companies in the concrete industry is probably doing one of the most unheralded jobs of looking at the entire life cycle of their product, of any industry that I'm aware of. Right now, probably on average 35% of the cement that's sold is, or a 35% level of the cement that's sold includes fly ash or blast furnace slag. So they're taking waste from other industries and incorporating it into their products in order to lower the footprints. And then you're seeing more and more that people are taking, okay, the second most used material on the face of the earth, what do you do with it when it falls down? A lot of recycled concrete applications coming in, a lot of people really seeking that. I mean, the Romans, if you've been to Rome, you see the Pantheon, it's made out of concrete. It's been there for 2,000 years because they didn't use steel. When we put steel in, we created a very interesting dynamic. They used horsehair, by the way. So they're trying to figure out how they improve not only the durability so they don't have the waste, but they're looking at every stream in and out of that cycle in order to do it. The other thing we didn't really talk about that we should is water. A lot of water gets consumed in the industry. We don't consume water. So if we don't even do anything, we can take about 80% of the water that is used and recycle it and use it again. If you put any effort in, you can get pretty close to 100%. Water is going to become an issue, I bet, next year at this conference, would be my guess. If the industry adopted our technology right now, it would save about 270 million gallons a year. That's about a third of New York City's intake in a year. It's a lot of water. Yes, huge. So they look at everything around it. You know, the circle of life in cement, they have really, I think, taken an unheralded forefront in that they're really just not getting recognized for right now.
Great. Let's see. Yes, here.
Bill Thowett with Booz Allen. You both are talking about probably two of the largest industries in the world with very big players, very big economic base, and as you both mentioned, the technologies you're talking about are disruptive. So are those big industry partners slow rolling you, helping you? Are they interested, or are they trying to suppress change in the industry?
Let's start with you, Tom.
Yeah, absolutely not trying to suppress it. I had the lead technical guy for one of the large guys tell me, look, I've looked at 300 of these, and I want to find one that's really going to be feasible, and we think yours is. We have been pleasantly surprised by the speed at which some of the larger companies are really engaged in working with us. Hopefully we'll have some news on that in the coming months, but that was always my big concern, because I've been on the other side of this conversation with a new technology. And so, I'm not real shy. I asked them. I said, look, here's what I worry about. What I worry about is that you're going to sit on my technology. So we're going to put an agreement in place that basically doesn't allow you to do that. So I think from a startup standpoint, as long as you're aware that there's a potential for that kind of event, you can have a conversation with that partner and find out pretty quickly. We found out in the first meeting, but it really has not been an issue. You have to realize the largest cement company in the world only has 6% of the market. The cement that came to this building had to come from within a 100-mile radius. They can't ship it any further. It's a very localized market, and you have to respect it that way. So the global players are global in that they have presence in different countries, but it's a very local market, and you have to respect that and understand it as you're trying to get your technology to expand real quickly.
So General Electric is an interesting sort of model in this case. They, about 3 or 4 years ago, wanted to get in the energy storage business, and they acquired what they thought was one of the forerunner, not fully developed technologies at the time. It's from a company called Beta Battery. It's a hot battery. I won't get into the details. However, they didn't squash it. They then dumped about $120 to $150 million in building a plant in New York, and now they are selling these batteries. And they are now a model, I believe, for the Siemens, ABBs, XYZ companies that are out there that are also watching what happens with GE, and they are trying to understand if they want to follow a similar model where they collaborate, or where they acquire, or do they want to have a joint, some kind of joint agreement, or do they instead just want to buy the product? And so we're working with these big boys every day. We built a big test stand in our facility back in Pittsburgh that is meant to have these guys roll in their gear one at a time over the next 4 or 5 months and run their gear on a great big bank of our batteries. And they're going to send their technicians and their folks in, and we're going to do an assessment. And then we're going to talk more about how to collaborate best. Is it going to be just straight collaboration? Is it going to be some other more detailed interaction? And so they're very supportive so far. And I think everyone recognizes, and all of the market research is showing, that energy storage is a gigantic market, and there's no killer solution that's fully on the market yet. And so they really, really want to be the first ones there, and as such, they're looking at us very seriously.
Okay. Yes, in the back in the light blue shirt.
Hi, Mike Pack, San Diego and Aspen. Question to Jay. When you were experimenting with all the products, did hydrogen ever come into play there? And the second question, we had an energy event in San Diego, and there's a firm came down from Oregon that has involved with the hydrogen power fuel cells.
Sure.
And through the conferences, there's always solar and all these other events and are the other sources, but I haven't heard the fuel cell, and okay. I just wondered, you've obviously touched on this.
Sure. So, hydrogen is really protons, right? Because it's really when you sort of dissociate H2 that you actually get some use out of them. The answer is we actually rely on hydrogen in our battery. And in some points during use, we have imbibed some material in our anode side of our battery. I won't get too technical here. We put some material in that when you hit a certain point as charge, you actually evolve hydrogen and store it. And then when you discharge the battery, it is reassociated and becomes water again. So we actually do have in our battery built-in hydrogen storage. It is not a fuel cell, though. A fuel cell is when you have a tank of hydrogen somewhere. You've either made it through natural gas cracking or you've electrolyzed water. And then you then feed it through the fuel cell and it recombines with oxygen from the air to form water, and then there's electricity. The reason people don't talk much, most people don't talk much about fuel cells like that in the context of renewable energy is that it's an inherently very inefficient process. The process of making hydrogen, regardless of how you do it, is in the order of 50 to 70%, 70% being natural gas cracking, which emits CO2, so people will rule that out. So if you're going to split it using natural light or wind or whatever, it's not that efficient. And then combining hydrogen back in with oxygen to form electricity is, again, 40, 50, 60% efficient as well. So the round-trip energy efficiency of a fuel cell hydrogen system is well under 40%. It's 30, 40, not in the 50s. That round-trip energy efficiency is absolutely killer when you talk about renewable utilization. It doubles or triples the size of the arrays needed. It's hobbling. And so a fuel cell system is a very good idea for some applications, but not so much for large-scale renewable integration.
Great. Just right up here front.
Okay, so I've got a Dave Preiser, Houlihan Lokey. I have a concrete question. So you're selling to an end-using industry, which is construction of things that have to last a long time.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons they want concrete is because it is malleable and flexible and lasts a long time. But you also talk about a startup and the imperative of moving fast before you run out of time, before you run out of money. Ultimately, can't sell cement unless the concrete guys will buy it. Can't sell concrete unless the construction industry buys it. Construction industry still remembers things like fire retardant plywood. Turned out 10 years later, it turned to mush and they had to rip it all out. It cost people a lot of money. You don't have a 10-year or a 5-year track record of reliability, of durability. So it sounds great, saves money, less lead time, better cash flow, great for the environment. All great sells. Well, yeah, it's great unless, how do you tell us it's still going to be working in 10 or 20 years? How do we know it's not going to disaggregate and we're going to have to rip it all out and it'll cost us all a lot of money? How do you sell as a startup? You've got a better mousetrap, you're quite sure of it, but you don't have the key selling point, which is we've proven the durability. You haven't.
Absolutely, great question. And I think that's one of the first things that we did was you basically take the universe of concrete applications, of which there are thousands. And what you try to understand is, what are the barriers to entry? What is it that I have to prove to make people comfortable that this application is going to be good going forward? And then you also have to look at it regionally. So you've got to understand the codes, you've got to understand what the testing requirements are, and there's the formal ones, and then there's the informal ones. So we went to a paver guy, and they're the codes, and we pass all the codes easily. I could start selling pavers tomorrow. But then his test was he puts them in a drum and spins them, and if they break, they're not any good. Same guy in Europe runs over it with a truck a couple of times. That's how you test that. So what we tried to do was lay out a collection, if you will, of applications that are kind of first wave, second wave, third wave. We understand how long the code approvals go. We understand how long they need to be in use so that people can get comfortable with their use. We're not going to be making a bridge out of this thing next year, but you know what? I do want to see what a sound barrier sounds like, or a Jersey barrier that's in the middle of the road, because those are applications that I can get into more readily and test out and understand while I'm waiting for some of these larger applications to come in. So, you have to lay it out by region, by application, and you go after barriers to entry.
Great. Well, we are at the witching hour. It is 2:20. And so I have learned a great deal today, and we are lucky to have two wonderful entrepreneurs who have not only taught us about these particular industries, but showed us the real virtues of impatience and the obstacles of policy and a number of other things. So please join me in thanking Jay and Tom.